I went to John Jr.'s wedding. Me and my wife sat at their table with John and his wife and, the main table at the wedding. So I really didn't know her well.
It's the third week of October, 2023.
I know she did some artwork and she put it in a Greek diner or something, hung it on the wall that was for sale. And I don't think the guy in the Greek diner was too happy about it, but
Watchdogs in the financial space trace about $2 million wired into the account of a certain Victoria Gotti. Yes, I am talking about the Victoria Gotti, wife of the dapper Don, John Gotti. However, they would soon find out that there was no need to be sneaky about it because the money Victoria Gotti received was legal. All of it. All of the $2 million was squeaky clean. You can imagine the shock. More than 20 years after the death of one of the most infamous mob bosses the city of New York has ever had to witness. And yet his family, more specifically, his wife, was still reaping the fruits of his dubious labor. It was incredible to say the least. And while I must admit that I am tempted to lay all of the accolades at John Gotti's cold feet for having the foresight to watch out for his family even in death, you must know that this wouldn't have been remotely possible if Victoria Gotti wasn't who the woman she was to him, the first lady of the mob. In a ruthless, testosterone-packed, hyper-masculine, hyper-illegal world of organized criminality, Victoria Gotti was the ideal mob boss's wife playing the crooked game to sickening perfection. So here's her story. Here's how John Gotti's wife played her cards so perfectly well that she's winning millions of dollars legally 21 years after his death.
To be a good basketball player or a baseball player, first of all, you got to be a good liar, a good low life, and an imbecile.
Take a lot of drugs.
You got to take steroids. You must take steroids. And anybody that takes steroids is a garbage pail.
In the final months before his demise, Victoria Gotti would visit her husband ceaselessly. On some occasions, she would even bring their grandson along, allowing her incarcerated husband to play the role of a grandfather who could impart some old-fashioned, somewhat questionable wisdom. But the love story between John wasn't a fairy tale. In fact, being a mob boss's wife can be a death sentence, because despite the fact that it ensures you will be insanely wealthy, it also means you will have to endure a lot of emotional hardship from a husband who will cheat on you, from his enemies who want to use you as a bargaining chip, and from the law who wouldn't bat an eye before they throw you in prison. So who did Victoria do it? It's one thing to make money, and it's a whole other thing to stay alive while you are making that questionable green paper. Born on the 27th of November 1942 in Brooklyn, New York, Victoria DiGiorgio grew up in a close-knit Italian-American family, but she was also half Russian. This should have been a problem for John Gotti when he would eventually meet her, but she had all the makings of a pure Italian woman. Victoria's childhood was filled with the sights, sounds, and traditions of her Italian heritage. Growing up in a neighborhood where loyalty and respect were valued above all else, she learned the importance of family and community from an early age. It was during her teenage years that Victoria first crossed paths with John Gotti, a charismatic and ambitious young man who would soon become a central figure in her life. The two met at a local bar in 1958, and their connection was instant.
Yeah, he's okay, you know. And just a year later then was when I met him, when I walked into the bar. So it was destined, and that was it. He was beyond handsome. He was like a Greek god. There'll never be another guy as good looking as him, I can tell you.
Despite the apparent dangers and uncertainties that came with being involved with someone in the mafia, Victoria was drawn to John's charm and magnetic personality, and against her relatively conservative family's wishes, their relationship blossomed, and they soon found themselves deeply in love. On the 6th of March 1962, when she was still 19, Victoria made a life-changing decision. She married John Gotti, sealing their bond and embarking on a journey that would test their love and resilience in the face of the dangerous world they were entering. It's difficult to say that Victoria didn't know who she was getting into bed with. It's difficult for her to say she was oblivious to his crooked career at the time. The reason I'm saying this is because Gotti, very early in his career, got into bed with Agnello Della Croce. If you don't know who that is, it's okay. Agnello is one of several names that have gotten lost to history, and for a good cause, because the man was beyond ruthless. In February of '68, about 6 years into their marriage, Gotti was neck-deep in truck hijackings for the mob, operating directly under Agnello Della Croce, when the FBI got the young Gotti on charges charges that saw him spend 3 years in jail. 3 years. There's no ignorance you can feign that'll not get you asking questions, especially when the man that was taking care of you and your kids at the time was Agnello Della Croce. You see, Agnello might have been there for Gotti when he was in jail, acting out the part of a great mentor and a good boss, but he was really the devil. No, he was worse than the devil. Best believe the devil looked up to this guy. You see, Agnello Della Croce was underboss to the Gambino crime family under Carlo Gambino himself. The man had a league of assassins who were more than ready to do his bidding at the drop of a hat. And yet, Agnello preferred to do all of his killings himself. I mean, the man's name directly translated to Little Lamb of the Cross, and that's all the information you need to know that he was a raging psychopath. According to the FBI's profile on the man, Agnello would often carry out his murders dressed as a priest, and he enjoyed staring into the eyes of his victims as their lives ebbed away, like he was some angel of death. So no one should tell me that Victoria didn't know her husband was a psycho on the streets, a mafioso through and through. Now, what I could hear out is if you said that she didn't know he was going to become as big as he did, because that path wasn't easy to say the least. It might have looked like he was rising fast through the ranks, with Carmine Fatico making him a capo, despite the fact he wasn't a made man at the time. But truth was, it was never meant to be that straightforward. In fact, after his third stint in prison, John Gotti would have to go right back in 1974 when he was given the unique honor of avenging the death of Carlo Gambino's nephew, who was kidnapped and murdered by Irish-American gangster James McBratney.
In the old mafia days, you had to work your way up from the bottom. You had to demonstrate loyalty and an ability to commit some crimes and do a little jail time. And that's when the mob bosses began to recognize you as somebody that they could trust and bring closer into the family and basically give more power to.
He spent another 4 years in jail on charges of manslaughter. In fact, he spent so much time in jail that his fairy tale love with Victoria turned dark and somewhat bitter. Sammy the Bull would later say that he complained a lot about his wife and how much stress she gave him. But things were about to get worse, so much worse. I'm talking about an event that almost destroyed their marriage permanently. But before we dive right into that, John Gotti's exit from his 4-year center would come in 1976. In 1977, he was inducted as a made man. And if there was ever a sliver of chance for Victoria to escape the marriage, it was now gone. But why would she want to escape? Apart from the fact that he routinely cheated, was never at home, was always in trouble with the law, and had more brushes with death than a Red Bull biker trying out the rocky terrain of the Himalayas, John took care of her. He did his part and kept them away from the gritty parts of mob. But life is incredibly cruel, and there is so much that is out of your control. In this case, the grittiness of life was about to find its way to their doorstep.
He was riding a mini bike. Unfortunately, he jetted out into the street, coming off the Belt Parkway, and the car hit him. Car hit him and killed him.
He was riding a mini bike. Unfortunately, he jetted out into the street coming off the Belt Parkway and the car hit him. The car hit him and killed him. Victoria had 5 kids for John, 3 daughters and 2 sons. The man you're seeing on the screen right now is her first son, John A. Gotti. Her second was the little boy on the mini bike. His name was Frank. He was just 12 years at the time of his death. And from the moment he was taken from the Gotti family, Victoria lost whatever thread of sanity that had kept her life from getting crushed by the weight of her husband's career choice. She went insane. Not literally, emotionally.
I know John had a lot of trouble with her. I know when they lost their kid, she kind of lost her mind a little bit.
Because you see, her children were all she had, and up until that moment, she had tried her best to shield them from the realities of their father's mob life. But just how much could she do? How would she explain the endless nights when he was away on a job that was sure to stain his hands? How would she explain the years of absence when John was locked up in prison? Victoria wasn't all too pleased with her husband's career choice, but she tolerated it as long as he promised he would keep their kids out of it. As you probably already know, this was not a promise he intended on keeping religiously, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. There was the death of little Frank Gotti, their son, and the accidental killer was their next-door neighbor, John Favara. 12-year-old Frank Gotti.
The death of Junior's younger brother Frank in a traffic accident was considered the most traumatic event in the family's history, and it would have serious consequences for the neighbor who killed him.
12-year-old Frank Gotti had borrowed his neighbor's motorized bike on the day he was giving every one of his friends a chance to try it out. Luckily for Frank, this neighbor was also a friend, and it was his turn to try out the bike. So on the afternoon of the 18th of May, 1980, Frank dashed to his friend's house and got on the motorbike. But before his friend could give any instructions or precautions for handling it, Frank had taken the bike on a ride. That was when the neighbor struck him with his car. Everyone knew it was an accident. It could have happened to anyone, but for the sake of this neighbor, it shouldn't have happened to a Gott. Because while Victoria was an inconsolable uncontrollable weeping mess, hooked on an unending dose of tranquilizers. Her husband was emotionless. John Gotti did not betray any emotion. He did not mourn his son, at least not in public.
What was the effect on your father?
He didn't show much emotion, but my bedroom, the vent was attached to his den, and I would hear him cry. I would hear him cry.
No one needed to tell anybody that Favara's days were numbered. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the man would disappear. But somehow, for some demented reasons, Favara did not take the hint. John Favara, the man responsible for Frank's death, made the bizarre decision to seek forgiveness from the Gotti family, knocking on their front door. Victoria hit his head and chased him off with a baseball bat. A woman who had shied away from violence, a woman who had barely condoned her husband's ultra-violent methods, that same woman was probably beginning to see the exception within her rules. Could it be that she sanctioned the set of events that happened next? A silent nod? A go get him to her husband without using words? Could Victoria Gotti be somehow responsible for the mysterious disappearance of John Favara in the aftermath of her son's death? Because what people expected would happen immediately took a while. John Favara had 4 months to skip town, 4 months to disappear with his family. I doubt Gotti would have given chase, but then, who knows? Because a week before Favara would disappear, the Gotti family went on a vacation to Florida. While they were sunbathing, Favara was abducted by some men at his place of work. By this time, Favara had already begun to plan to leave. It was too late. His body was never found, and he was declared dead by the FBI in absentia. Some say he was beaten, hacked into pieces, and his parts thrown into a river. Others say that while Favara was alive, he was dismembered with a chainsaw, stuffed into a barrel filled with concrete and dumped in the ocean, or buried somewhere on the lot of a chop shop. Eventually, the authorities came to believe that mob hitman Charles Carnelia killed Favara and disposed of his body in acid. Like I said earlier, this was the turning point for the Gotti family. Nothing was ever going to be the same. But more specifically, the relationship between John and Victoria evolved into a near surrender. She knew she couldn't leave John, but could she trust him to protect them? She tried. She asked her husband, made him promise to not involve their son, their only surviving son, in the mob business. If the reason she did this was because of a premonition of more dangerous events to come, she was right, because John Gotti was about to make a move that would make him the center of the world's attention.
Where were they hit?
They were hit in the head and in the body.
There were witnesses, but not many. They told police of an apparently well-trained and heavily armed hit squad.
Just before 5:30 on a December evening in 1985, mob boss Paul Castellano stepped out of a limo in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan and was shot to death. The 4 assassins who gunned him down were conspicuously dressed in trench coats and Russian fur hats. John Gotti, the man who arranged the hit, sat in a car nearby to make sure his boss was dead. You see, Paul Castellano was the boss of the Gambino crime family that John functioned under, and John didn't like Castellano's instruction not to trade in drugs. Castellano's reason was simple and quite logical. He was worried the federal government was paying too much attention to their drug activities. Gotti ignored Castellano's instruction and continued to have his people trade heroin. They even began bad-mouthing Castellano behind closed doors. But because the federal government was watching, news of wiretaps showing Gotti and his associates were still dealing drugs, and talking smack became public. John Gotti must have figured that his days were numbered. So rather than wait around for Castellano to get to him and his crew, he planned a very daring hit on the mob boss. A hit that wasn't properly sanctioned by the 5 families, a hit that should have got him killed in a reprisal attack. Surprisingly, the hit took him to the top. Now Victoria was the wife of the head of the 5 families, the Gambino family, arguably the most powerful in New York. With John at the helm, the Gambino family expanded its operations, venturing into new territories and illicit businesses. The heroin trade, once dominated by rival factions, fell under Gotti's control. He established connections with Colombian drug cartels, ensuring a steady supply of cocaine into the United States. The allure of money and power was intoxicating, and John Gotti reveled in his newfound wealth. Lavish parties, extravagant vacations, and a lifestyle of excess became the norm for the Gotti family. Victoria, adorned in designer clothes and jewelry, stood by her husband's side as they basked in the spoils of their illicit empire. But she hadn't forgotten the promise she made him swear to. The question was, had he? I'll keep it a buck with you because I'm not the kind of guy who would willingly waste your time. John broke that promise as soon as he made it. He got his son John Jr. into the mafia, and soon enough, through some hookery-cookery, John Jr. became a made man. Victoria had no idea for a long while that her only surviving son was following her husband on mini-missions. She didn't know when he took his own charge, and when he'd become a made man, she still had no idea. And then there was the increased scrutiny from law enforcement. John Gotti's flamboyant persona and brazen disregard for authority made him a target for the FBI and other agencies. As Victoria Gotti found herself living in the constant shadow of surveillance and danger, she had no idea her son would also be caught in the crosshairs soon enough. But, and this is perhaps the one quality that kept Victoria in Gotti's life through the years, she remained fiercely loyal to her husband. In the media, the media began calling her the First Lady of the Mafia, a title that carried both prestige and danger. Her unwavering support and resilience in the face of adversity solidified her position as an integral part of John Gotti's empire. But the higher you climb, the harder you fall. And John Gotti's ascent to the top and his reign as the boss of the Gambino family would eventually come to an end. And as it did, it threatened to destroy everything Victoria and John had built together: their world, their business, their family. When John Gotti killed Castellano, the Italian mafia was scandalized and the rest of New York watched in awe. It was like a Scorsese mob flick come to life. However, what the law enforcement officers didn't expect was the dangerous game that Gotti would play with them. Gotti, with his million-dollar hand-tailored suit down to his witting one-liners to his charming smile, was courting public opinion, and the public loved him. They loved him so much he became a bona fide celebrity, and he reveled in his celebrity status, granting interviews and playing cat and mouse with the FBI. Now, you can imagine this behavior must have really bothered Victoria. It was counterintuitive for any criminal. Gotti was drawing needless attention, and sure enough, the attention would bring criminal charges along. But despite his criminal activities, Gotti seemed untouchable, earning the nickname the Teflon Don because serious charges just wouldn't stick. Time and time again, Gotti walked away from high-profile trials, leaving the public in awe and law enforcement frustrated. But little did he know that the FBI was patiently building a case against him, determined to bring him down once and for all. The FBI realized that to successfully prosecute the hierarchy of the Gambino family, they needed to gather irrefutable evidence of their criminal activities. They embarked on a mission to secretly get Gotti and his associates on tape discussing their illicit enterprises. Patiently and methodically, the FBI worked their way into the intricate structure of the Gambino family. They developed informants and cooperators who gave them a backdoor into the family's criminal operations. Wiretapping phones, conducting surveillance, and planting bugs in key locations became their modus operandi. The FBI learned about the Gambino family's control of labor unions and their influence in various industries. They discovered that the family was well insulated and only accessible to outsiders only through surveillance cameras. But the breakthrough they needed came from an unexpected source. The FBI's wiretapping of Angelo Ruggiero's phone proved to be one of the most successful wiretaps in history. They overheard conversations that implicated the Gambino family in a major heroin trafficking operation. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. The FBI also learned about Gotti's crew and their involvement in criminal activities. They discovered that Gotti was using the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club as his headquarters, a seemingly innocent location that served as a hub for his illicit operations. The FBI rented an apartment nearby and installed cameras to record everyone who entered and exited the club. However, Gotti was no fool. He was aware of the possibility of surveillance and often conducted secret meetings in the hallway behind the club, away from prying eyes, so the FBI planted bugs there too.
There was a widow named Mrs. Sorelli who lived in apartment number 10 above the Ravenite. Right around Thanksgiving, we found out she was going to go away for Thanksgiving, and we saw her leave with her bags. I think one of her nephews picked her up, and then shortly thereafter, our entry team went to the apartment, put the mic in, and it became operational on November 22nd, 1989.
The bugs captured incriminating conversations between Gotti and his associates, discussing labor union rackets, murders he had ordered, and other criminal activities. The FBI had finally obtained the evidence they needed to charge Gotti with running the Gambino family. In 1990, the FBI made their move. Gotti, along with his trusted associates Gravano and Locatio, were arrested at the Ravenite Social Club. The charges against Gotti were extensive: multiple murders, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. It was a stunning blow to the Gambino family and a victory for law enforcement.
The Teflon is gone, the Don is covered with Velcro, and every charge in the indictment stuck.
The FBI's crackdown on organized crime had made significant progress. The evidence presented during the trial was overwhelming. Testimonies from former associates, wiretapped conversations, and surveillance footage painted a damning picture of Gotti's involvement in organized crime. The jury had no choice but to deliver a guilty verdict. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on multiple charges, including murder, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. The Teflon Don's luck had finally run out. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, leaving his empire in the hands of his son and leaving his family, Victoria specifically, all over again. Now this was the difficult part. While Gotti was trying to play the puppet master from prison using his son had gotten tired. This was not his rodeo. He wanted out. In mafia circles, they called it closure.
So Joseph told me, John, it wants closure. I said, Joseph, that's not that word ain't in my son's vocabulary. That's overeducated, unintelligent motherfucker. Right? Closure.
The senior Gotti didn't want it. He didn't want his son to leave the mob. But this was what this was what she had wanted from the very beginning. If only her husband would have listened to her. Because fact is, the junior Gotti was terrible at being a mafioso. Even when he had his literal strings being pulled by his pops, he blundered so much that the FBI got their hands on a list of all the made men in the Gambino family. It was a huge mess. And by 1999, he was got on RICO charges by the feds. And it was beginning to look like he'd end up like his father, which at this point was far from a compliment. The senior Gotti now had throat cancer and was getting into feuds in the pen that left him bloodied. Thankfully, he saw beyond his pride. And thankfully, before he died, he gave his son his blessings. After John Gotti passed in 2002, Victoria Gotti disappeared from the face of the earth. While her daughter, son, and family profited off the now legendary Gotti name that they bore, she stepped back into the shadows. You will not find a video of her doing an interview. The only interview you might find was done on audio, and never again. Victoria Gotti became the opposite of her husband, tying a neat conclusion to their legacy of crime. So after the feds had investigated and seized all they could, after the law became bored with them and began chasing the new shiny criminal on the block, the Gotti family assumed a state of normalcy. They were now legitimate, no longer criminals. Victoria Gotti had been wise enough to know when to stop what her husband had started.